Sit back, relax, and join William and Lee on their journey through the strange and mysterious world.
Welcome to Season 2, Episode 22 of Strange and Mysterious World. How do I introduce this one? It's going to be a bit of a weird one tonight. We have Tristan coming on, who is our friendly neighborhood Satanist. Hey, all right, we'll have to see how that goes. Please, guys, also remember now, people that are listening around the world, and a lot of the times we do podcasts, it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, when people come up with whatever's going on and these ideas that they're pitching, and, you know, it doesn't mean that we believe in it. That's just, we have a platform that people can talk, and, you know, you gather your own information. So it's information gathering, man.
So anyway, yeah, I mean, like when the thing is, I just heard this guy was going around saying he's the friendly Satanist. So I just was like, we got to hear what this guy's,
what's the story, man?
The friendly Satanist. So here we go. Here he is. Let's let him in. It's Tristan Kapp, the friendly Satanist.
All right.
Okay, great. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes. How's it going?
Good in yourself. Thank you for making it.
No, just
thank you for making it. Jeez, on such short notice. I mean, that's amazing.
I took a gander at some of your content, and it's fascinating to see the topics you delve into.
Yeah, well, we try to do all these weird and wonderful things. So, you know, there's not one specific topic. If you limit yourself to one topic, then you kind of going to be out of a podcast in about a few months. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting, different beliefs and different understandings and theories and that kind of stuff. So, Tristan, tell us, man, what's your story?
But just tell us about yourself, because like you've got a PhD in religious studies. Just tell us a bit of your background, like of you like where you've come from, especially what you've studied and your background.
Yeah, well, I've almost got my PhD. I just finished it earlier this year and handed it in. I'm still waiting for the examiner feedback. But yeah, so I did my PhD in religion studies, focusing on sexuality and spirituality in esoteric traditions specifically. Geographically speaking, I basically tried to illustrate a trajectory between the West, East, and Africa to try and see how esotericism manifests between the West, East, and Africa, because my view was that esotericism basically had a sort of too much of a Western hegemony. And so I wanted to investigate how sexuality and mysticism and esotericism manifests in the East and the West, in the East and Africa. And so that was the topic for my PhD thesis. But my background is in theology, specifically systematic and historical theology. Although I did a bachelor's and a master's in theology at the University of Pretoria, I started developing a keen interest in sexuality since a young age, in terms of research and academia. As my very first research was about sexuality or premarital sex in terms of biblical constructs. So I grew up Christian, and my main, I'd say, deconversion came about when I started questioning the biblical ethics on sex and sexuality and marriage and all of that, and tried to navigate the realms of mysticism and sort of unlocking one's own one's own personality and your own identity through, embracing one's own sexuality. And I found that the construct and this whole idea of the body and, the entire concept of fleshly desires being banned, very odd from, the Christian side, and especially in terms of being a LGBTQI activist. I found it quite ironic that the church wanted to close its doors to individuals who were different. And so from my Christian upbringing, I tried to essentially break open the doors of thinking this conservative realms in trying to focus of, I'd say, engaging the marginalized voices, especially those ostracized, especially those who embrace the unorthodox. And by then I didn't know that, but I found myself developing a systematic, keen interest into the unorthodox, or the what do you call it, the sinful, if you want to put it like that. So I wanted to know why people, or the church rather, had such an obsession with sexuality, and why the body in and of itself was such an impediment to the religious journey. And so I got into the entire concept of body politics and stuff, especially, as I said, the LGBTQI debate. Became very passionate in the whole discourse when one of my friends came to me, a lesbian. She told me, like, listen, you're a theologian, explain to me what the Bible says about homosexuality. And I thought, well, that was an odd question. And by then I was a Christian, but I also wanted to incorporate my friend's views. I didn't want to ostracize her. And so I started questioning the biblical ethics on sex and sexuality, and I decided to do my independent research for my Bachelor of Divinity on the topic. And that basically spiraled me into a deconstruction journey, which I am still, I'd say, discovering the parameters of to this day. And the idea of sexuality and the powerfulness, or the power of the body to unlock self-knowledge, or a knowledge about oneself. And that's what got me into esotericism to a certain degree, and mysticism especially. And, eventually with my master's, I investigated sexuality as a spirituality without the church. So essentially regarding the body or sexuality as sacred without, institutionalized religion per se. And so for my PhD, I developed on that and tried to basically broaden my horizons by investigating other religions that are non-Christian. So occultism, Satanism, theosophy, Sufism in Islam, Egyptian paganism, and so on and so forth. Even African traditional religion, which was absolutely fascinating. Things and knowledge traditions I didn't know existed, all encompassing this entire rich wisdom on the body and on the self. And these two kind of constructs that people might think is mutually exclusive was not. And so I guess, my mind, was broadened as I read more, as I wanted to understand more about, one's bodily identity as a sort of a spiritual construct, but not in the traditional religious way. And that's when, forward a bit back, when I was in my third year of my bachelor's degree, I was stabbed. I think I was stabbed 9 times by a knife attacker who wanted to steal my phone. And right there and then I decided to fight back, and was stabbed 9 times and ended up in the ICU for about 3 or 4 days. And then moved on to high care and then got released. And thereafter I developed a sort of a critical eye. And I think that's one of these experiences that people don't necessarily elaborate on. I think a lot of people want to focus on this idea of a near-death experience as this grandiose experience of seeing celestial figures, whereas it wasn't that for me. And so based on all of this comprehensive history of what I went through, I intensely developed a critical viewpoint of the world, which led me to atheism. And as soon as I encountered this sort of near-death experience per se, because I almost died at that evening, it wasn't necessarily a sort of that I was decided to be a-religious there and then. Rather, it was a systematic process that was triggered by this catalyst with my stabbing, and that got me to criticize certain things about life around me. And basically...
Sorry to interrupt you there. What happened in your near-death experience? Did you experience anything like profound, or was it just kind of so we can get some context of any? So it was just
no,
like
not at all.
he's just
Which was actually quite surprising to me, because I've back then I was quite evangelical, and so I believed in these sort of say spiritualesque type of narratives of near-death experiences of people seeing celestial figures, which later on just became clear to me that certain people experience near-death experiences based on the hormone that is released in the brain before you die, which is similar to DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, if I'm not mistaken, which is basically a sort of a hormone that eases the transition per se between consciousness to complete death, and brain death, essentially. So I didn't see any of that, which caught me by surprise, and which I'd argue was also one of the main questions as to my deconversion. Why didn't I see these celestial figures? Why didn't I see a ring of angels circling around me, or some celestial figure trying to protect me, or whatever not? So essentially I decided to shove it to the back of my mind, and then certain other things happened which got me to question the idea of suffering. And I think that is the most important thing that was relevant at that stage, is the idea of suffering, which was very important to me, because I think once the actual near-death experience that I think I really went through is I gained a novel understanding of suffering, of individuals, of seeing suffering around me and the injustice of society. And I think that was what changed my viewpoint. And so that got me to focus explicitly on marginalized individuals within my own context. And I started to see how traditional religious institutions ostracized certain individuals for not conforming to a certain de facto, heteronormativity, being straight, being, completely, what they would call traditionally masculine or traditionally feminine, essentially. And these ideas were quite conflictory to me, because I understood from a biblical perspective, and being educated in the Bible, I didn't really see this legalism, or this religiosity, or rather this even the idea of the what one would call a spooky spiritual type of woo-woo nonsense with regards to the new evangelical movement. I couldn't see the reconciliation of these two things, because they were in each of their own ways very conservative and ostracizing certain individuals that did not accord with their de facto narrative. And so these ideas rather made me question even further, which resulted in me pursuing atheism. And then after atheism, I again found myself questioning things out to the boundaries, which eventually led me to Satanism. So Satanism, what basically forced, or rather encouraged that transition, was the fact of I gained a compassion for marginalized individuals. And I also was very, what memes would call with regards to ADHD, a contrarian little bitch. So that idea of being contradictory, of standing against things was quite attractive to me. And so the idea of the oppositionality behind the idea, by then I didn't know the breadth of it, or the depth rather, of the philosophy, which I gained later and which enriched as I went along. So it gained me a new stage for which to, I'd say, vociferate my stance on certain issues I felt strongly about. And with the added controversy and the fact of how finally now there's a stage where people couldn't, help but take note, or rather pay attention to what I'm saying. So then now they didn't miss me. Whereas in the church and in certain traditional atheist organizations, I just blended in and nobody really cared about what I had to say. So I was looking for that distinguishing factor. And as an academic, we are trained to look for certain lacunae, or certain gaps in the market, if you want, or gaps in research. And one of these things was a pioneering voice for Satanism, or alternative religion, in Southern Africa, or in South Africa specifically. And I saw that as an opportunity for me to capitalize on that sphere. And essentially, being a Satanist again, that was very controversial. It is still controversial in many aspects. But then as I went along in academia, I was able to underpin it or substantiate it with rigorous academic facts, as well as, scholarship, to defend my points of view. So it's not just this rebellious thing of being a rebel without a clue, but rather being a rebel with a clue, with the intent of fostering a community of alternative individuals, if you will. And so the idea behind it was merely to not just evolve as an individual, but also challenge myself to a certain degree, to move beyond certain parameters of just a black and white fallacy of there's theism and there's atheism. I'd like to think Satanism incorporates both, instead of where it basically affords a loyalty to a deity. I think Satanism is a sort of atheism that embraces a sort of spiritual religiosity without necessarily devoting it to an external entity or deity or deities. Rather, it encourages one to devote that energy to your own self or your higher self, as is very prominent within mystical and esoteric traditions. The idea of navigating the spiritual or the spiritual journey of just being oneself and then moving to a sort of higher plane of consciousness, which sounds very, weird and very airy-fairy, if you will, and to the ordinary uneducated ear, it sounds very woo, very weird. But it's not that deep, essentially, although it is in theory. But in practice, it's all about recognizing your own authority and recognizing that you are the center of your own, or the master of your own ship, the dictator of your own journey.
Now,
cool.
So there's a couple of things, Tristan, that I want to ask. Well, kind of delve a little bit into. So I know, look, I've been to a hospital a couple of times for various things. I'm talking about proper surgeries, not like breaking bones and stuff. I'm talking about like kidney stones and all sorts of stuff where they put you under anesthetic. Now, as far as I know, and what I've heard, is that when you go under this sort of process, you almost go into a dead sleep, and you wake up from it like it was literally you remember going in and that was about it, and you wake up again.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people don't have those experiences of your out of body experiences where you're seeing things and you're looking at your body. So I'm assuming, and what people have said to me is that the anesthetic that you get put on is almost blocking that. So you don't remember it, or it might have happened. You just cannot remember. It's almost like a memory wipe. And it's almost like, what's that drug that they use when they, the roofies, when
yes, yeah.
Where the girls actually don't know, somebody's roofie they drink and they have no clue.
Date rape drug.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the same sort of thing. It's like a blocker. It blocks out your memory. So that's just one thing when you're talking about that you never experienced it. I was thinking, well, look, did you go under anesthesia? Because that might have been the actual reason why you might have actually seen something, but when you woke up, it was like, oh, fuck, I didn't see fuck all, man. It was like just darkness. That was just a thought.
Yeah, well,
it was just a thought that might have happened.
No, that's really interesting that you should mention that, because of the fact that when I was stabbed, I wasn't immediately, rushed to the hospital. I remember lying at the side of the road bleeding, and I couldn't breathe to a certain degree, and I was very close to dying because the feeling I always explain to people, it's like the feeling of dying is similar to like falling asleep. You suddenly feel tired, and you want to go to sleep. And that was essentially what the essence of dying felt like in that moment.
Okay.
But if it weren't for the individual by my side that kept me awake, I believe I would have slipped into a coma and not have woken up. But I'm completely no expert on medicine whatsoever. But from my limited understanding on scientific conjecture and reading a few scientific journals here and there, the idea of the consciousness and the subconscious is a very, very complex thing and is somewhat debated in a lot of fields, from religion to philosophy to psychology. And the idea of I'd say the subconscious, and that's where Freud and his personality theory comes in, where he spoke about the ID, the ego, and the superego, is where anesthetics, or rather, deep sleep is essentially restricted to the superego, or rather where you are confronted with certain aspects of your own intrinsic self, but in a deeper consciousness. And that's essentially what is only accessible during sleep in most instances, which stimulates a certain brainwave. So you've got the various brainwaves during certain levels of consciousness during sleep, especially, which basically verge or varies from alpha brainwaves to delta brainwaves, for example, or gamma brainwaves. So in essence, I think definitely, yes, it's possible to completely forget about what you endure while you're having that outer body experience. And essentially, I think that is why esotericism or occultism, in essence, came about, is because individuals were curious about this interpersonal state of self and how one can access that deeper state of knowledge, if there is such a thing. And so esotericism essentially translates to, or comes from the Greek esua or ace, meaning inwards or into. And essentially it forces one to delve into oneself. And the Latin equivalent is occult, which derives from the Latin word oculare, which means hidden or veiled. And a lot of people, and this is something we term in academia called conspirituality. A lot of conspiritualists, where individuals tend to conflate religious spiritual ideologies with conspiracy theories. They tend to conflate these two ideals and essentially come to a point of saying, well, these mystical aspects of oneself are merely communicating with the dead or communicating with aliens and stuff like that. So that's not what I mean by that. With it's not hidden, it's not deliberately hidden or secret knowledge, such as, for example, the Vatican hiding knowledge or the Area 51 type of hidden, but rather the unorthodox practices. Remember, occultism and esotericism in and of itself, these practices derived mostly, according to modern scholarship, from pre-Enlightenment societies. Around the 17th century is the earliest form of where we can find the term esotericism even mentioned in manuscripts. And I think it's a French manuscript, if I'm not mistaken. But nonetheless, so and it was in French. So l'ésotérisme was the first occurrence of the word occultism, or even remotely to these unorthodox traditions, which was basically a way of exploring knowledge pertaining to the inner realms, pertaining to transpersonality, pertaining to the connection between the self and the divine, or whether these two things are the one and the same thing, or separate things or separate constructs, was what these traditions sought to investigate. And you can see all of these types of traditions all over the world. So that's why it's so difficult to essentially to term it or to theorize it, because of this thing, because of the fact that it's not a homogeneous, codified topology of a practice. It's something that you can find in every religion out there. You can find it among the Gnostics. I mean, even Paul and early Christianity had examples of some esotericists or esotericism in it. And Satanism, if I am to juxtapose it, is rather a later development, a more novel form of what one would call Western esotericism or occultism per se. But occultism is generally an umbrella term, which is similar to esotericism and refers to unorthodox practices rather pertaining to the inner or innermost subconsciouses, and pertains to what one would experience as mystical, or a near-death experience, as what you referred to earlier.
Okay. So Tristan, so you're saying like everyone that practices something that's not Christianity is basically practicing Satanism?
Not necessarily, no. I wouldn't say that at all. What I would rather say is that lived religion, essentially, the theory of lived religion is as such as that it cannot be policed. And so lived religion essentially translates as the concept of religion operating in non-traditional spaces. So you've got traditional spaces like churches, masjids, mosques, temples, and etc. These are traditional spaces for where religion is practiced. Whereas non-traditional, or rather unorthodox practices of these religions operate outside of these traditional spheres. A brilliant Dutch scholar called Ruard Gansevoort wrote brilliant papers on the idea of lived religion and how it cannot be policed. So no matter how much one tries, you cannot tell people like this is the Catholic way of living, which is where the word Catholic comes from. It comes from the Greek katholikos, which means the proper or correct way of following, or the correct doctrine. And so the idea of lived religion is essentially to practice it outside of these traditional spaces and relates to unorthodox traditions, which essentially includes Satanism, but there are unorthodox practices within Christianity, which a lot of authorities or watchdogs within Christianity might call non-Christian. I mean, a lot of evangelical Protestants say that Catholics are not Christians, whereas the Coptics, for example, would not recognize the Protestants or the Catholics as Christians. And so on and so forth. Even the Jehovah's Witnesses and these Seventh-day Adventists. So these are all forms of breakaways, of sects, rather, that break away from these traditional mainstream forms of religion, essentially because they disagreed with how religion was practiced initially. And this is what esotericism essentially represents, of which Satanism is one, but it is not the only religion. And I wouldn't be so, I would say it's very dangerous to, for example, juxtapose it within a sort of black and white fallacy of saying everything that is not Christian is essentially Satanism. In a certain worldview, yes. In certain perspectives and more conservative worldviews, yes. Everything that is non-Christian is essentially equated with Satan, but that's a topic for a later discussion.
So how do you practice Satanism? How do I
practice Satanism?
Well, before we actually get to that, so I just wanted to ask a question here. So, Satanism, as the world knows it, okay, is literally the reverse of Christianity. So they've got Baphomet as the god, if you want to call it. There's the upside down crucifix. There's a lot of bloodletting. So it's like a reverse. I mean, there's even an anti-pope.
But there's a lot of bloodletting and
no. But what I'm saying
is in the Bible. Both of those.
Yeah,
but sacrifices on the tabernacle.
But what I'm saying is, you're 100% right. So what I'm saying is what we know it, and I mean, if you go back into South Africa, because I know Peter Maritzburg at one stage, I think in the early 80s, was one of the biggest. I think it was actually known as the satanic capital of the world, and guys were digging up corpses and they were killing cats, and it was like ridiculous. Police were after them. There was demonic possessions and all sorts of stuff. So my question is, why Satanism? Why call it Satanism and not something, I don't know, maybe you're an esotericist and you believe in...
So that's fascinating. And to just clarify a few things, Baphomet, first of all, has nothing to do with Satanism whatsoever. It was later adopted in Satanism, and I actually did a part of my PhD thesis on the idea of Baphomet, which comes from Alphonse Louis Constant, or rather his more famous name, Eliphas Levi, who drew this enneagram, or this iconography of Baphomet, which served as a symbol for duality, the idea of as above, so below, the idea of masculinity and femininity combined, the idea of nature, divine, and a lot of esoteric and occult symbols meshed into a single thing, and also the idea of a goat, inspired by the sabbatical goat of the Witch's Sabbath, which was an earlier artwork or rather tradition within ancient paganism and the Celts and Druids. So the idea of this Baphomet was also a symbol, and a lot of people had this conspiracy theory again, where they believed that Baphomet, or the name Baphomet, derives from an anagram for the name Muhammad, or Muhammad, which was the prophet of Islam. Whereas, they believed that the Knights Templar actually worshipped this idol, whereas that was actually a sort of a conspiracy theory of the day in and of itself, which derived from a French play around the 18th century, which I also elaborate a bit about in my PhD thesis. But essentially, so the Baphomet served as a symbol, not as a god, not as a deity, but rather became venerated as a symbol for all that is esoteric and all that is occult. And furthermore, the upside down cross is also not satanic. That is something that derives from Catholicism. And quite frankly, Eliphas Levi himself was raised as a Catholic. But later he decided that the Catholic tradition, or this monastic life, wasn't for him. And so he decided to basically pioneer what we define today as esotericism and occult, in where he tried to explore unorthodox ideas of what we know and learned today as astrology, or what's that potion making? I can't remember what you call it. Anyway, the idea of mixing certain herbology and stuff like that.
Like alchemy.
So, yeah, alchemy. Yes, thank you. So all of these things basically came, or rather was pioneered by Eliphas Levi, who started engaging in these conversations. Even the pentagram, or the five-pointed star, which a lot of people believe is in and of itself a satanic symbol, was rather something that was Christian innately to begin with, in pointing to the 5 wounds of Christ, which was adopted by the Catholic Church by finding it within the pagan communities where it represented the 5 elements. So basically, and I have something here and I'll explain it quickly. So here you've got the inverted pentagram, which is what Satanists use. So essentially you've got the 5-pointed star, and each of them refer to the 5 elements. Now, within traditional paganism, you've got the star that looks like this. This is paganism. This is a pentacle without the circle. It's just a pentacle. It's just a star. It's used in witchcraft, in conjuring and stuff like that. Again, and ancient practices which are very much very much understood.
Yeah, it's also Leonardo da Vinci used that. That was the man. What's it called?
Leonardo da Vinci did use it.
But also, it's Saturn. Saturn, when it goes, is it Saturn? I can't remember which planet it is, but it's funny, Saturn, because Saturn. But like it goes around the sun, and every single time that the Earth goes in front of it, and you mark it, it actually makes a pentagram. I can't describe it. Like you can look, you go look at YouTube videos. I can't remember which planet it is.
Every 8 years.
Every 8 years, it hits a certain point when the Earth is in front of Saturn, in line with the sun, and then you can mark it off every single time it does that, and it makes a perfect pentacle.
Interesting. I did not know that. I'll definitely go take a look at that. I don't know anything about that, but that's really interesting. But yeah, anyway, so basically it refers to the 5 elements. So you've got fire, earth, water, and spirit, essentially, and wind, which is in paganism all of the the elements. And the spirit is essentially known as the ether, which is the realm of the undead in most cases as well. Whereas in Satanism, you've got the inversion. And in general occultism, everything that is inverted comes from the tarot practice. Everything that is essentially referred to as upright in a position, where you draw tarot cards and it has an upright position, it has a certain meaning. Whereas if it is inverted, it basically opposes or inverts that meaning in and of itself. And again, Satanism does the exact same thing. So instead of with the ether, Satanism inverts the pentagram, and essentially the point points downward, which essentially roots it in the earth. And then Anton LaVey, the creator of modern Satanism, essentially thought about this idea and tried to connect the pentagram, or the inverted pentagram, to the goat of Mendes, which was then also inspired by Eliphas Levi's Baphomet. So the entire concept of it is basically rooted in a rich tradition of occultism and esotericism. And there's a brilliant, brilliant book written basically explaining the whole occult philosophy in, I think, a very understandable way. And it's a 1992 book written by Professor Stephen Flowers, the Lords of the Left-Hand Path. Absolutely brilliant book, which basically describes the normative religions into a sort of what I would say a false dichotomy in sense of the left-hand path and the right-hand path. So the right-hand path essentially are the orthodox normative religions. Remember, we spoke earlier about lived religion, which is the orthodox and Catholic, or rather the proper way of religion, the traditional, straight and narrow religiosity. Whereas the left-hand path is essentially the pre-enlightenment, unorthodox, mystical, esoteric, occult practices, which tries to understand the idea of transpersonality, mysticism, and consciousness, and all of these things that essentially are frowned upon in traditional religions. And Satanism falls within the left-hand path. But back, what I wanted to also say about the upside down cross is that a lot of people think that the upside down cross is a satanic symbol, whereas it is not. Rather, it is a Christian symbol used by the Catholic Church because of the fact that Saint Peter was crucified and he did not feel worthy to be crucified like Christ, and therefore he requested to be crucified upside down. And crucifixion was, if you know anything about ancient history and biblical history, was a very common form of torture for ancient Romans. So it was actually one of the most brutal forms of torture, and the Romans were very creative when it came to torture methods. And crucifixion was one of the few, bad torture methods that, the Romans had to torture their victims. And like that one character in Life of Brian basically says, could have been worse. And he was quite correct because of the fact that the Romans had this X cross, which was again an X sort of thing that a piece of wood looked like an X, where the individual was tied up upside down, and they began flaying the individual just above his feet in front of his family members. And it was specifically done in that manner so that the individual would stay conscious whilst, they were flaying him, so as to create maximum pain for the individual. So essentially, these were very creative individuals when it came to torture and things like that. So essentially, what I'm trying to draw back to is the fact that these symbols aren't necessarily tied to a certain philosophy. It's not tied to a certain religion. Essentially, it was a thing that became an icon or a symbol associated with something. And that is essentially what symbol means in the original Greek term. It's symbolon. It means it's associated or connected to an image or something, and therefore creating a sort of a post hoc type of analogy or reasoning in terms of associating one thing that happened together and therefore conflating it all over. So yeah, but essentially in its core, Satanism as a left-hand path philosophy is not the inversion of Christianity. In fact, it is rather the empowerment of the individual through the embracing of certain critical, scientific, as well as hedonistic lifestyles. So you are essentially a skeptic. You are a reasonable individual that uses science and scientific conjecture to determine your worldview. But again, in other instances, in other iterances, Satan and Satanism is a symbol which can be interpreted in various ways, and it depends on who you're talking to. But in the general consensus, in de facto atheistic Satanism, which is what I represent and what I form a part of, Satan is essentially not a metaphysical entity or the opposer of God, as it is commonly portrayed in Judeo-Christian theology, but rather essentially a symbol for your own free will, the symbol of opposition against theocratic tyranny, the opposition against everything that seeks to suppress yourself towards embracing oneself and engaging in that aspect of trying to attain a sort of what one would consider a higher consciousness or one's higher self, as in who you want to be, what you want to be, where you want to be in life, which is all dependent on you. So it all comes down to you. You're responsible for your flaws, you're responsible for your mistakes, and also for the good things that you do. Essentially, you are responsible for them too. And to basically conclude my last sentiment and answering the previous question, why call it Satanism and not, for example, an esotericist? You see, that is where it becomes interesting. So I get that question a lot. And essentially, Satanism is basically the conflation of a political and anarchistic philosophy with religio-spiritual traditions. So it combines the brilliant, I'd say, aspects of mysticism, of occultism, and esotericism with essentially embracing oneself and individuality and anarchism. So as rebelling against that which is oppressive. And in most modern societies, you've got this concept. It's basically the antithesis to asceticism, the idea of restricting one's own body to, the pursuit of the spirit and neglecting the fleshly or the earthly or the material, essentially, because we are all material beings. And so neglecting that which is material and towards a spiritual endeavor is somewhat contradictory. One of our base needs as humans is to engage in fleshly or material things such as hunger, food, sex, etc. These are basic needs that drive our anthropology or our existence as human beings. And to negate that is essentially a practice of asceticism, which was introduced by Christianity, but before that was introduced by the Stoics, such as Marcus Aurelius, who basically introduced these things to restrict individuals and believed that one can achieve a higher state of consciousness through restricting oneself and through abstaining from the material in order to attain a sort of moral superiority above other individuals. But that was practiced very lackadaisically, and essentially it was a product of society in and of itself. And the idea that certain individuals wanted to be more spiritual than others. So it was very solipsistic in and of itself, where individuals wanted to be very arrogant and perceive themselves as higher and, basically self-centered. So, yeah, essentially Satanism, I'd say, opposes the concept of asceticism and the idea of rejecting the material or the earthly for the sake of the spiritual.
Okay, so the other question then that was kind of in there as well, then I'm assuming like your Alpheus Levi and Aleister Crowley, those are the guys that brought in the killing of, you know what I mean? I'm sure you don't do that, killing cats and
Black magic.
On the 13th.
So Eliphas Levi and Aleister Crowley never killed, according to my knowledge, any animals. In fact, Aleister Crowley, and I also did quite some research on Crowley for my PhD thesis in the study of Western esotericism, because of the fact that if you study esotericism, names like Crowley, LeVay, as well as Eliphas Levi, essentially are indispensable figures when traversing a discourse on these important figures. And Joseph Laycock is a prominent scholar of Satanism, and as well as some other Swedish and Nordic scholars who devote a lot of time in studying Satanism within the Western esoteric framework. But yeah, the entire concept of slaughtering of cats and martyrdom of animals and crime and criminality is something somewhat of what I referred to earlier, a conspiritualist narrative. And I recently published a research paper on that matter, basically describing the idea or exploring the idea of occult crime as a de facto mens daimonica. So in South African jurisprudence, you've got this mens rea and mens daimonica. So mens rea is in criminal jurisprudence the idea of criminal culpability, the extent to which a lawful entity is responsible for the crime that he or she commits. And essentially that is the criminal culpability that exists in our legislative framework. Whereas some scholars, a brilliant scholar in criminology, Sonja Rupčić, in a 2021 article, suggested, based on certain case studies of African traditional religion and Muti murders, as well as alleged satanic murders and occult-related murders, that there should be a demarcation within South African jurisprudence called mens daimonica, which translates in Latin to demonic mind, which basically affords someone the idea that they can commit crime while under possession of some entity or some evil force, or under the guise of occultism. So the entire
apparently you can get off in South Africa off the crime of its possession. I mean, is that a thing? Because we were speaking to, I don't know, Lee, if we could talk about it, because I think the guy, when we interviewed him, said don't talk about it. But apparently he was saying that in South Africa, if you kill somebody and you say you were possessed by the devil or something, that you could get off the murder.
So that's essentially also what I studied for my my recent research paper. And according to my knowledge in South African jurisprudence, and I speak under correction, I'm not a legal scholar or any way related into criminal justice. But from my understanding, the only thing that I know of that is remotely related to that is the Witchcraft Suppression Act. And the Witchcraft Suppression Act does not say or provide criminal acquittal based on the idea of demonic mind or that you were possessed. That is a traditional narrative or a traditionally religious conspiracy theory that was informed by biased opinions of ancient, or rather traditional religions and other, non-mainstream religions. And the idea of it is not enshrined in South African Constitution due to the fact that the Constitution provides freedom of religion, belief, and opinion, unless these beliefs, opinions, and things are espoused or used for hatred. But as far as that is concerned, there's no legislation within South African jurisprudence to essentially provide that as a sort of a mandate for criminal acquittal. Also, due to the fact that I believe that it is quite contrary to the law of evidence in the Criminal Procedure Act, which essentially affords individuals, I'd say, the idea that they are not responsible for certain things based on certain testimonies. So basically having evidence, physical evidence, as indicative to a crime, as well as testimonial evidence or expert witness evidence and witness testimonies as indicative for what serves as evidence for a crime, or rather positions an individual as guilty. But again, I'm speaking under correction as I'm no legal scholar.
Okay. And then so William asked a question earlier. So how do you go about it? What is your routine? I mean, is there a church that you go to? What is your how do you
do rituals? Skin the cats?
Well, no.
no. I know Crowley used to just hump his assistant. He didn't kill any cats or anybody. He used to hump his assistant to get open the portals.
Crowley, I would admit Crowley was a bit of a strange, odd fellow, but I think that was also due to his childhood trauma that he essentially projected outwardly and created some deviant behavior. And I think that is also a response that happens from childhood indoctrination. I mean, he was very angry at his upbringing because of the fact that he belonged to a Christian fraternity when he was in his early 20s. Very, very staunchly conservative. Very English, and he rebelled against that quite, explicitly. And I suppose in his own way, his anti-theistic perspectives, weren't always, I'd say, above board. And I don't think a lot of his methods were essentially paramount or something that is praiseworthy, but one thing that came from his perspectives was the idea of thelema, which is the Greek word for will. And that is the underpinning of all of this, is the idea of the will, the idea that everything and anything occurs through one's will, and where he discerns the sacred from the profane, such as what Messiah Eliade describes in his book, The Sacred and the Profane, when he distinguishes between sacred space and profane spaces, he says that even a non-religious man can experience a sort of sacralization or sacrality as like a religious man who is in church or something like that. So essentially, Crowley developed this idea of thelema, where he distinguishes the sacred as something that is willed, or something that comes out of your will, as opposed to something that is habitual. So everything that you want to do essentially is mystical and, sacred. But there's no, rituals at least in my perspective. And what I do think that a lot of individuals do practice religion or sort of ritualism, as, for example, the Satanic Temple in the US, who practice this sort of unbaptism ceremonies and certain, I'd say, shock theater towards causing aesthetic terrorism. So there's no real liturgical or ritualistic element in the Satanism as a de facto religion. I think the term of religion in Satanism, as it is rather envisioned in the Satanic Temple, is rather used as a political tool to basically claim entitlement to the same privileges and rights that normative Christians, for example, and normative monotheists, including Muslims, basically are entitled to because of their religion, and essentially basically claim to the same non-derogable rights in the name of fighting theocracies, fighting against, or not fighting, but opposing the unjust systems of oppression that emerge from these traditional religious institutions, if that makes sense.
So what's the difference between Satan and Lucifer?
That's an interesting question, and it's basically down to terminology. If you look at the Hebrew Bible, both terms occur in the Old Testament. The only difference is that Satan is Hebrew and Lucifer is Latin. But a lot of people conflate the two ideas, but they are two vastly different things. But let me start to explain the simple part, or the simple one. So Lucifer in the Hebrew Bible occurs only once in the entire Bible. And it occurs in Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12. And the Hebrew is Hallel ben Shachar, which translates to the bringer of the dawn, essentially. And that was a poetic analogy or a metaphor that refers to a Babylonian king who thought very highly of himself. And so he was compared to a cherub. And so Lucifer, or the Latin term Lucifer, is in the Latin Vulgate, which is the Latin translation of the Hebrew Bible. And basically, Lucifer is then the Latin translation of Hallel ben Shachar, which refers to the Babylonian king. And where basically the poetic narrative is essentially trying to, or the pericope rather, illustrates a poetic narrative similar to Icarus, of this guy who thought very highly of himself but flew too close to the sun, and that eventually led to his demise. And so that kind of narratology is what is exemplified in the case of Lucifer. There is also certain, I'd say, historical inferences that allude to the fact that Lucifer might derive from certain other Near Eastern myths compared to the Babylonian god Ishtar, as well as her beloved who was cast down from the heavens into the underworld, and etc. But I'm very much that part of my knowledge is very rusty. So I'll keep it simple in saying that Lucifer refers to a Babylonian king in the chapter of Isaiah, or in the book of Isaiah in the Hebrew Old Testament, whereas Satan. And that is where it becomes particularly interesting. So Satan as a noun occurs, I'd say, more than once in the Hebrew Old Testament, although it occurs in two different methods. In the one instance, it is used as a noun in terms of referring to opposition or adversariality. In the latter sense, it is referred to as a sort of pronoun, but that was a later development within monotheistic Yahwism, or rather what we would call monotheistic Yahwism. Not that Yahwism or the Judaism, what we would call it today, was monotheistic in terms of worshipping a single god. They merely rejected other gods and in lieu worshipped a single northern eastern storm god called Yahweh. But anyway, so Satan essentially, apart from being a term referring to opposition or oppositionality, was not considered a de facto opposer of Yahweh. Instead of, it was more represented as an accuser in the latter sense, as where it is referred as a pronoun. It was rather a celestial being, where Yaldabaoth...
Sorry, Tristan, it had something to do with, if I can recall the story, it had something to do with, it was almost like two lawyers fighting, one for and one against.
Yeah.
So, and he was known as the accuser. So, that's I remember that.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's precisely because of the fact that if you look at the ancient history and how the cosmogony worked, is that these ancient, civilizations had this idea. I mean, think of Olympus and the Greek mythology. The gods had this heavenly plane, similar to the I'd say where the Romans gather and basically had political debates. I mean, we all can remember Gladiator and that circle where these individuals had their sashes and fought, and everybody had to stand up and point fingers and accuse. And that is how democracy was born. Anyway, so in that instance, that is how the celestial parliament, if I can put it that way, worked according to that field of reference or that idea. And so the story goes essentially that Yaldabaoth had a bunch of sons. And one of his sons was Satan, or the accuser, who wanted to, basically challenge the supreme deity, which was Yaldabaoth, to a, claim to his authority, because of the fact that Yaldabaoth claimed to be the sole authority, and he claimed sole godhood, essentially, and rulership over all other celestial beings. And essentially, this accuser rebelled and said, listen, who basically told you that you could be God? Who died and made you God, essentially? And so he challenged it, sort of a Julius Malema of the heavenly realms, trying to challenge the authority, essentially, and basically just be unruly to a certain degree. And essentially what happened is that this celestial being just cast him and a third of his followers out of parliament, similar again to how Julius Malema and the EFF has been, thrown out of parliament. And it's not to say that these two are related, understand me correctly. I'm merely using it as a metaphor.
Symbolism.
For our audience. I'm not trying to say that there's a de facto inference between these two figures. But yeah, anyway. So essentially, they rebelled, and the accuser, Satan, basically manifested as a rebel. But the idea of opposer was actually a rooted thing in the ancient Near Eastern mythos in the Hebrew Bible, is such of where there are several inferences in the book of Samuel and in Kings, where angels and even other enemies of kings would present themselves as Hasatan or Lisatan, an opposer or an opposition to another individual. So it was not just accuser, it was also a sort of oppositionality. And so that was what it wanted to illustrate. And essentially that is where the syntactical context of certain words make it a bit more ambiguous as to the translation. But anyway, without delving into semantics, then again to the latter part of where Satan becomes more than just a term for oppositionality or accusation. It essentially, as the theology of ancient Judaism evolved, became associated as a de facto opposer. And that was born out of ancient Zoroastrianism. Now, Zoroastrianism is one of the oldest monotheistic faiths in the world, still practiced today. And it comes from ancient Persia, which is today modern Iran. And essentially, they worshipped a god called Ahura Mazda and his opposer Angra Mainyu. The Ahura Mazda was the god of light and fire, as well as Angra Mainyu, which was the god of darkness and evil. And this religious message was brought to the Persians by a prophet called Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, as we know him in English. Nietzsche wrote a book basically creating this fictional character based on that Persian prophet called Also sprach Zarathustra, and thus spake Zarathustra. But anyway, so essentially this development within Hebrew or Judeo-Christian theology manifested as a sort of dualistic cosmological dualism, in where evil was on the one side and basically good was on the other side. And that was basically causative or caused by the early Persian empire, where I think it was Xerxes developed a sort of diva inscriptions, where certain gods were considered demonic, or which was basically what most archaeologists and linguists perceive as the earliest form of what we perceive of as the word Satan or demon, is diva. And so essentially developed into what theology would consider as a evil god and a good god. And essentially what we know as religious syncretism, these ideas from Persia, as well as monotheistic Yahwism in the ancient Near East, conflated and mixed and mingled because of the migratory nature of these civilizations. And it became one big conglomeration of two different philosophies based on the fact that it wanted, or based on the idea of survival. Because when you are conquered by a nation and you are given the choice, either conform or die, you conform for the sake of your survival. And essentially that is how Satan, as a celestial figure, became an oppositional entity based on the already model established by ancient Persian Zoroastrianism, distinguishing between cosmological dualism in terms of good and evil. Then furthermore, with the Greek Hellenization of the ancient Near East, the idea of cosmological dualism became further entrenched, and there was a distinguishing between two different realms, such as the heavenly realm and the, damnation realm, if I am to put it that way. And essentially, fast forward again, then you've got the Romans and the early church, and then the idea of Satan manifested in ancient Rome as a sort of a conglomeration of ancient pagan beliefs to unify the Roman Empire under Christianity, which is a historical nightmare in and of itself. So I'm trying to condense it as much as possible. But yeah, so to recap, Satan in and of itself as a linguistic term translates to opposition or oppositionality, whereas the term Hasatan, or Satan as a personified figure, is a sort of accuser, which is then portrayed as a celestial figure based on theological developments borrowed from ancient traditions such as Zoroastrianism in Persia, the cosmological dualism in ancient Greece, as well as then early church developments and conglomerations of demonizing certain traditional pagan beliefs, and so essentially creating a figure known as Satan and what Christian theology understands as Satan to this day. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I understand now why you say you call yourself a Satanist, because it's not really as Satanism as we know it. You're just opposing the norm.
Yes.
That's basically
but yes, but it's not, I'd say, again, it's not a sort of willy-nilly oppositionality. I still acknowledge the freedoms of others and the freedoms to respect that, and the I'd say core clause to respect that freedom, and also in acknowledgement that to negate the freedoms of others and willingly encroach upon those freedoms is to negate my own. So I just want to clarify that. So essentially, it's rebelling for the right reasons against oppressive regimes. I always explain it to people in this way, that Satanism is what Christianity was supposed to be and what was embodied by the historical Jesus, whereas Christianity has become what, people think Satanism is.
So don't you get any death threats, like going around calling yourself the friendly Satanist?
I've received several. Quite a few. There's, I think, one in particular that I will never forget. And there was even a newspaper article about that when I was involved with a satanic organization a few years back, where this one guy, typical white Afrikaans guy, DM'd me on TikTok and said that he will slit my sister's throat, rape her. Or no, he will rape my sister, slit her throat, and give her a Christian baby.
Jeez, that
That is
sounds
something I'll never
satanic.
forget.
And he's
Yeah.
Christian. He's Christian.
Yeah. I will never forget that he had an FLM profile picture, beige profile picture, which basically stood for the Farmers Lives Matter type of ideology. So it's actually quite surprising. But I mean, again, as I said earlier, people think that Satanism is essentially evil and grotesque and sacrificial, whereas they ignore all the biblical passages that refer to human and animal sacrifices. I remember distinctly a passage in Kings where two women are essentially telling each other, like, bring the children so we may eat them. So there's cannibalism, there's genocide, there's animal sacrifice, the smearing of blood. There's even a tradition in the Levitical chapters where a bull, as part of the Levitical celebrations, where a bull is slaughtered and the priest essentially smears the blood all over the place. So it's quite ironic that this sort of accusatory narrative, if I am to put it that way, no pun intended, is juxtaposed or projected towards Satanists, whereas we are completely oblivious to the fact that these things are mentioned de facto in the Bible. There is no reference to animal sacrifice, the raping of virgins, the kidnapping of babies, the sacrificing, eating of babies, cannibalism, rape. All of the conspiracies you've ever heard is not mentioned anywhere in any satanic conjecture, and I'm willing to bet my life on it.
Yeah, because the whole of Leviticus in the Bible, they tell you how many bulls you must kill, down to even doves, and like they go through, and how much blood you got to spill in the tabernacle, how much, like 7, you got to put it on the horns, you got to put 7 things, and then you got to pour the rest of it in front of the tabernacle. I mean, it's like a whole chapter of just blood sacrifice.
Absolutely.
Like, from every animal, and like how, and through every sin, how many animals, which animal, and how the animal must, like, how, if it needs to be the best animal, and it goes down to even like small birds and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And there's even a distinction between certain sacrifices for certain sins. So you've got the blood offering, and then you've got the burnt offering, which is where the sacrifice is either slaughtered bloodily and the other sacrifice where the sacrifice is burnt. And then and also based on that, there's also in one of my favorite passages to reference when these types of discussions emerge is 1 Samuel 15, where basically Yahweh gives Samuel, or was it Saul? I think it was Saul. He gives him the mandate to go and kill all the Amalekites. Nobody knows what the Amalekites did to deserve that other than being Amalekites. But he instructed Saul to murder all of the animals, all of the cattle, all of the children, all of the women, every single living thing in that entire Amalekite place is murdered. The same with the Canaanites and all of the other, I'd say, fringe and oppositional and enemy nations essentially to the Israelites, because unpopular opinion, the Israelites and the God of the Old Testament was quite similar to Hitler, being quite fascist in terms of claiming that the Israelites were a sort of an Ubermensch, or a superhuman, or a human race above others, a superior human race in being circumcised and being chosen, and so on and so forth. So this entire concept of election and this entire idea, which was then perpetuated into Christianity, is something quite ironic and which has perpetuated and been at the forefront of a lot more human rights abuses in terms of today's.
Well, then the Christians took it on, and then they just started also just genocide after genocide after, and all the
Absolutely.
inquisitions and
Absolutely.
everything. They just carried
Yeah.
on killing everybody.
Yeah.
Sounds quite
Yeah.
satanic to me.
But that's also
Exactly.
why I think that's also why I think they tried to, especially with modern day Christianity, they're trying to separate themselves from the Old Testament and New Testament. Because that's why I was saying in most
Yeah.
hotel
Oh,
rooms
but
you
the
go
blood's
to,
been spilled, though.
you see the New Testament by, the King James version of the New Testament. There's the Old Testament. They're trying to, like what they're doing in America with, they're trying to hide it away, like with Camilla Harrison.
Yeah,
They're trying to
I
hide
think
him away.
it's really interesting because I think that Dan McClellan, a brilliant scholar of the Bible and religion, made a video about it the other day, where he spoke about that in extreme detail, and he basically illustrated that exact same narrative in where certain individuals basically cherry pick certain parts out of the Bible, and it's not. I think it's a very dangerous statement to basically have a sweeping statement and call it modern Christianity. I think a lot of contemporary movements in lay Christianity have this tendency towards a dispensationalism, which refers to the individuals who basically refer to the Bible as certain dispensations or distinguish between certain dispensations in the Bible. You've got the old dispensation of the covenant, and then you've got the new dispensation under the new covenant of Jesus Christ. And a lot of the more evangelical traditions tend to follow that. A lot of more Protestant theologies also tend to follow that, whereas other theologies and other institutional religions aren't necessarily on that bandwagon necessarily. So I do think we need to acknowledge that there are good Christians out there who do not appeal to these sorts of narratives, but also are trying to distinguish between the fact of how to be decent individuals aside from these dispensational narratives. But there are definitely individuals in the majority of cases, and you can definitely see it in the American far right, who are definitely exemplary of these narratives, who are basically conflating, and I refer back to my earlier my earlier term, my earlier term, conspirituality, in where these individuals conflate religio and spiritual traditions with political and social conspiracy theories in advancement towards their own individual agenda. And one of these, or all of these in particular, I have referenced, throughout our discussion thus far, which is what they are. They are humans who are driving their own personal agendas and basically blame or consider a attribution of divine entitlement or divine instruction to it, which is no different from accusing the devil of being the catalyst behind committing crime. It's basically the same side it's basically the different side of the same coin. But essentially, I digress. What I merely am trying to say that these political conspiracy narratives are very dangerous in providing individuals with a perceived superiority over other individuals in terms of committing certain human rights abuses. And in particularly, the latter is more prevalent under, I'd say, the dispensationalist Christian elites, where they believe that, oh no, the Old Testament is a previous dispensation and they are solely under the covenant of the New Testament, despite the fact that the entire Gospel of Matthew is very, very strict on basically adhering to the law, in where Jesus himself says that not a iota or a tittle of the law will fall away until it has all been fulfilled. And I can't remember the Greek word that is used, but essentially the Greek word that the original manuscript uses is not to say that, referring to some sort of prophesical fulfillment, but rather the completion of it, the idea of individuals following each of these laws mentioned in the Old Testament, in the Mosaic and Levirate law to the letter. and so as to be loyal to and basically get into heaven.
So what is
But that's,
your
of course,
what does the university think that you're studying religious studies and you going around saying you're a friendly Satanist?
well, I suppose that these two things happen in, I'd say, isolation from each other. My identity as the friendly Satanist is somewhat of a personal, I'd say, thing that I've decided I wanted to do something uniquely and engage in unique conversations in my personal and free time, as well as leading discourse and being also, to a certain degree, opening academic discourse to the populace. I mean, it's quite frustrating to sit in academic conferences and share knowledge with individuals, of the same caliber. I think that's wonderful, and I think it's highly valuable to exchange ideas. But I think that essentially that academia has a tendency of basically separating itself from individuals on the ground level, and that's my passion. I wanted to educate people outside of academia as well by bringing my academic knowledge to individuals on the ground, by saying that there's no distinction between myself and individuals on the ground. Yes, I swear. Yes, I am a rambunctious, contrarian individual that enjoys swearing and being sort of a rebel and being outspoken. And I think that these things are, I'd say, complementary when you find yourself in academia. And academia is not stoical. It's not supposed to be stoical. Just because you have a doctorate or a professorate or a master's degree doesn't mean that you have to be stoical. Doesn't mean you have to constantly speak in academic jargon. But trying to explain things to individuals to enrich their identities. And I think that is why the friendly Satanist identity happens in isolation from my affiliation with the university, and therefore my opinions and my ideas don't necessarily reflect that of the institution, quite the contrary. And I do think that some of my professors have, on quite numerous occasions disagreed with me. But that is the nature of academia. That is the nature of freedom of academia in Southern Africa, as well as the freedom of the press and freedom of speech and association. It's the fact that despite the fact that I am the friendly Satanist, I am constitutionally protected by these same laws. And essentially, there's not much they can do about it. But also, the university made me who I am today by introducing critical thinking, by introducing academic rigor and education, quality education, I might add, which is a privilege in and of itself, which a lot of people do not have access to, might I add. The university made it possible for me to inform myself with resources and tools that they gave me. And I try my best to use it for good, again, in unorthodox methods. But I do think that there is a place for individuals such as myself in more, I'd say, open-minded contexts. I wouldn't say that the university agrees with all that I do, but again, I don't really am adherent to the university's agreement. I add value to academia in my professional academic capacity, whereas in my lay capacity as an individual, as the friendly Satanist, I try to incorporate my knowledge by empowering the individual on the ground with the necessary tools so that they don't have to go sit in a 2-hour, 3-hour lecture to gain the resources that I had. And so that is why all of my research thus far is open access, accessible, free to access. And I believe in as far as possible, trying to do that. And if not, free and open access, at least affordable to a certain extent.
Okay. Amen.
Yeah. And tell me,
I think it was appropriate to throw an amen there.
How do people get hold of you?
Well, they can email me. Satan@atheists.co.za is my email. Alternatively, Tristan@paganrightsalliance.org is the other organization where I'm affiliated. I'm the spokesperson and interfaith officer for the South African Pagan Rights Alliance, which is also quite of an interesting endeavor in and of itself. because of the fact that I've never thought that I'd become such good friends with pagans, but I think that I've come to realize that I've got more in common with individuals on the alternative religion and atheistic sphere of religion, because essentially we are all fighting the same battle. We've got the same, as the French would say, raison d'être. The reason behind our existence is just basically we just want to coexist. And unfortunately, due to stigmatization and political hegemonies, we find that very difficult. But essentially, they can reach me through Facebook. They can reach me through all of social media. I'm all over social media, basically. Instagram, the Friendly Satanist. I'm the same everywhere. But yeah, through email, I mainly respond, and then move beyond that.
Okay, awesome.
Cool, man.
Yeah, cool.
Well,
just
Any other
thank you,
questions
yeah.
from your side?
No,
Well,
it's
yeah, not
interesting.
at the moment, but I mean, I'm glad we got a hold of you, because maybe we'll call you on for like some other pagan stuff, or mystery
happy
school
to.
things,
We do like a
or whatever
witchcraft
else we could.
Oh yes, I'd be very excited to engage in that.
Yeah, we can do that
Okay,
at some
cool.
stage. Yeah,
So,
cool.
but
Yeah.
awesome, Tristan. Well, thanks so much. It's great. Thanks for coming on such short notice again, and yeah, it was very interesting.
Yeah,
No,
100%.
I'm so glad that you guys offered up some time out of your busy schedules for myself, and I appreciate you inviting me to take part in this conversation. I really enjoyed it. You asked some really wonderful questions, and I appreciate you allowing me to blabber on and to rant on, because unfortunately in most instances a lot of podcasts understandably constrain me with time and certain interruptions, but I'm happy if I added some value to your platform.
Yeah, cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of food for thought. Thanks, man.
Yeah, 100%.
Cool, guys.
But we'll chat to you soon, man. Yeah, we'll chat again.
Awesome. Please stay in touch.
Yeah, we'll do. Thanks, Tristan.
Cool. Cheers,
Okay,
Tristan.
Lee.
Cheers, man.
Cheers,
Okay.
William.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, jeez. It was
Cool.
actually quite interesting, man. Eh?
Yeah, it was. I mean, he's a very intelligent guy, but
But very
I
different
think
to what I thought. I had a
no.
very different idea of what he was going to say.
But
I thought he was
exactly,
going to
but-
say like, "Hey, I'm like we skin cats every second day," and fuck, I
I
don't
know.
know. Eh?
I know. I don't know what to expect.
No, cool. All right, no, so we'll definitely bring him on again. Witchcraft is, I think it's a very interesting topic, but we'll get to that at another stage as well.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, no, cool, man. Just again, thanks, guys and girls from around everywhere. Thank you for following us. Thank you for subscribing. I hope you guys, enjoyed it tonight. It's a different one. We were expecting something different, and we got something actually very, very interesting. So yeah, thanks again, and thank you, William, for your time again, and we'll chat again next week.
Thank you, Lee.
Yeah.
Yeah, lekker, man.
Cheers, bud.